My brother-in-law called me a charity case in front of 40 people at my own mother's retirement party. He said it loud enough for the caterers to stop moving, and he smiled after, the kind of smile that says he'd been waiting years to do exactly that. I had just walked in from the parking lot, still in my wet clothes, because I'd driven straight from a site visit 3 hours away. My coat was damp from the drizzle outside. My hair wasn't done. I hadn't had time to change, and I'd called my sister twice on the way to ask if casual was okay. She never picked up. The venue was a private room at a restaurant in Scottsdale my mother had always loved. String lights, round tables with white linens, a slideshow running on the back wall of photos I had never seen before. I spotted my sister near the bar in a burgundy wrap dress, laughing at something my brother-in-law was saying. When she saw me walk in, her smile didn't drop exactly. It just recalibrated. I waved. She looked away. I found a spot near the edge of the room and waited for someone to acknowledge I'd arrived. My mother was talking to her book club friends across the room. She saw me. She gave me a small nod, the kind you give a neighbour you run into at the grocery store, and then she turned back to her conversation. I told myself it was fine. I was used to being the one who showed up and had to find her own place in the room. But then my brother-in-law approached, glass in hand, heading toward a group of family friends I'd known since childhood. I stepped slightly into his path, not blocking him, just close enough to say hello. He stopped, looked at me, then looked around at the small circle forming near us and said, loudly, clearly, with perfect comedic timing, "Oh, she actually made it. I figured she couldn't afford the gas." Someone laughed. A cousin. 2 or 3 others smiled awkwardly. One of my mother's friends pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. I didn't say anything. I just smiled the way you do when someone steps on you in public and you're too aware of the room to react. I picked up a sparkling water from a passing tray and excused myself toward the back of the room, where the light was dimmer and the tables weren't quite full. I stood there for a while next to a potted ficus, watching my family move around the room like a choreographed piece I hadn't been given the steps to. My sister gave a toast. It was lovely, warm, funny. She mentioned their childhood road trips, my mother's cooking, the way she'd always shown up for every recital, every graduation, every hard moment. She didn't mention me once. Not as a sister who had also been there for those moments. Not as a daughter. Not even as an afterthought. I was in 3 of the photos on the slideshow. In 2 of them I was partially behind someone else. In the 3rd, only my shoulder made the frame. I drove home that night in silence. No music, just the sound of the highway and the very particular kind of ache that comes from being made to feel invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to love you. I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea going cold and started thinking about the timeline. Not just that night, all of it. The family group chat I'd been left out of for 4 months before I noticed. The WhatsApp thread where they planned Thanksgiving without me and only mentioned it after the fact. The way my sister had started referring to my mother's house as our house, meaning hers, and my brother-in-law's, even though I'd been the one driving my mother to chemotherapy appointments every Tuesday for 8 months. Even though I had spent 3 weekends repainting the kitchen and fixing the back fence because my mother couldn't afford to hire anyone and wouldn't ask. I had never asked for anything in return. I thought that's what family did. I was wrong about what kind of family I had. 2 weeks after the party, I was at my mother's house helping her sort through the linen closet when I found it accidentally. A manila folder tucked behind a stack of old pillowcases. My name was on the tab, written in my mother's handwriting. I almost put it back without opening it. I almost did. Inside were copies of documents I'd never been shown. A deed, an account statement, a 1-page letter signed by my mother and dated almost 3 years ago, shortly after her cancer diagnosis. She had put me on the deed to the house as a co-owner. She had opened a savings account in both our names and had been depositing into it ever since. The letter explained why, because she was afraid that if she didn't formalize it, the house would be absorbed by decisions made without me. She wrote, "I know you don't ask. That's exactly why I'm making sure." I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after reading that. She was downstairs, moving around the kitchen. I could hear the sound of her slippers on the tile. I didn't say anything to her then. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. I needed to think. That weekend I drove to the county assessor's office and pulled the public records. The deed was there, exactly as the document said, my name beside hers. What I found next to it was not. There was a second deed filed 6 weeks later, after her cancer diagnosis, after the folder had apparently been assembled, that listed the property as transferred into a family trust. The trust had one trustee, my brother-in-law. My name was not in the trust documents, not as a beneficiary, not as a co-trustee, not even as a named family member. The co-ownership deed my mother had filed, superseded, effectively erased. I drove to the coffee shop on the corner and sat in my car for 20 minutes with the engine running before I could make myself go inside and order anything. I kept replaying the conversation at the retirement party, the smile, the 40 people, the caterers who stopped moving. I figured she couldn't afford the gas. He had known then. He had known what they'd done. And he smiled because he thought it was already over. I called my college roommate that night, the one who went to law school, who now does estate planning in Phoenix. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is how I knew it was serious. She said, "Your mother's original co-ownership deed has legal standing. The question is whether the trust was created with proper consent or whether it was structured to circumvent an existing legal interest." She said the word circumvent very carefully. She also said you should look at when the trust was established relative to your mother's diagnosis and any conversations she may have had with her attorney at the time. I started making calls the next morning. The estate attorney my mother had used for years had retired. His firm had passed her file to a younger associate. When I reached that associate, she was polite but careful. She told me my mother had signed the trust documents willingly. She told me the trust was entirely valid. She told me my mother had not requested I be included. I asked to speak with someone senior. She said she'd pass along my information. No one called back. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the second ring, and there was something in her voice, a slight hesitation before she said hello, that told me she already knew why I was calling. I asked her directly, "Did you know your name was removed from the co-ownership deed we both signed?" A long pause. Then, "Your sister and Garrett said it would be simpler." Garrett. That was the first time she'd said his name to me like he had standing to make decisions about her house. I said, "Simpler for who?" She didn't answer. She said she was tired. She said she was tired. She said we could talk about it this weekend. I said okay. I said I love you. I meant it. When I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down everything I could remember. Every conversation, every date, every document I had copies of. I wrote for 2 hours. At the end, I had 4 pages of notes and the very specific kind of clarity that doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like the fool dropping out from under you in slow motion. I did not cry. I pulled out my laptop and started going through my own financial records. Here is what they apparently forgot. I had been the one managing my mother's household accounts since her diagnosis. Not because anyone asked me to, because someone had to. I had set her auto-pay on her utilities. I had consolidated her insurance. I had negotiated a better rate on her homeowner's policy by spending 4 hours on the phone across 2 separate afternoons. And I had kept every receipt. More than that, 3 years before any of this happened, at the very beginning of my career, I had taken a small inheritance from my grandmother, $18,000, and put it into a tech fund that a co-worker had recommended. I hadn't touched it because I kept forgetting it existed. I checked the balance for the first time in 2 years on a Tuesday night in February. It had grown to just over $400,000. I stared at the screen for a while. Then I opened another tab and looked up the appraised value of my mother's house. I wrote down the number next to the fund balance. Then I wrote below it. They thought they were outmaneuvering someone with nothing. They weren't paying attention. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not yet. I called my college roommate again and asked her to recommend an estate litigation attorney in the Phoenix area. She gave me 2 names. I called both the next morning and scheduled consultations. The first attorney was efficient but transactional. The second one, A woman who had been practicing for 22 years, who had a cactus on her windowsill and a college pennant on the wall, and zero patience for vagueness. Listened to my entire story without writing anything down, and at the end she said, "The original deed is your foundation. Everything else is noise they created on top of it. Noise is removable." I hired her that afternoon. What followed was not dramatic, it was paperwork. It was calls I had to step outside during my lunch break to take. It was Friday evenings going through documents instead of doing anything else. My attorney filed a formal challenge to the trust on the basis that the co-ownership deed established a pre-existing legal interest that could not be unilaterally overridden without my consent or proper legal process. The response from my brother-in-law's attorney came 11 days later. It was 4 pages of language designed to sound definitive and make me feel small. I read it twice. Then I scanned it and sent it to my attorney with one line. "Let me know what you need from me." My sister called that same evening. I knew before I picked up that the tone would be different. It was. She didn't say hello. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Protecting what's mine." She said, "You're going to destroy this family over a house." I said, "I'm not the one who took my name off a deed." She hung up. I put my phone face down on the counter and made dinner. Pasta. The kind you make when you're tired and need something simple to do with your hands. 3 weeks later, my attorney informed me that the opposition had offered to settle. The terms, I would be added as a named beneficiary in the trust, with a clearly defined interest in the property, documented and legally binding. My attorney asked me how I wanted to respond. I told her, "I want my name on the deed exactly as my mother originally intended, not a beneficiary designation that can be amended. The deed." She said, "That'll take longer." I said, "I know." It took 4 more months. During those months, I still drove my mother to her follow-up appointments. I still picked up her prescriptions when the pharmacy called. I still came by on Sunday afternoons and helped her weed the garden, which she was too stubborn to give up and too tired to do alone. We didn't talk about the legal process. We talked about her roses and a book she was reading and whether the neighbour's new dog was as friendly as the neighbour claimed. Once, about 2 months in, she put down her pruning shears and said, without looking at me, "I should have made sure it was done right the first time." I said, "You did your part, I'm doing mine." She picked her shears back up. I think that was the closest we came to saying everything. The morning the final documents were ready, I was at work when my attorney called. I stepped into the stairwell to take the call. The building was quiet at that hour, just the hum of the HVAC and my own voice echoing slightly off the concrete walls. She told me the deed had been refiled. My name was on it. The trust had been restructured to reflect the existing legal interest. It was done. I said thank you. She said I was welcome. We hung up. I stood in the stairwell for probably 2 minutes longer than I needed to, not celebrating, just breathing. That evening I drove to my mother's house. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up, which I almost never do because I was always afraid of being somewhere I wasn't expected. She answered the door in her housecoat, glasses pushed up on her head, a paperback in her hand. She looked at me for a second and then stepped back to let me in, the way you do with someone you've been waiting for. We sat at the kitchen table with decaf coffee and the rest of a coffee cake she'd apparently made the day before. She sliced me a piece without asking. I ate it. We talked about her book. We talked about the spring. We talked about absolutely nothing important for an hour and a half. When I got up to leave, she walked me to the door. She put her hand on my arm briefly and said, "You were always the one who showed up." I didn't cry until I got to my car. Garrett never apologized. My sister sent me a text 2 weeks later that said, "I hope we can move past this." I read it 3 times, put my phone down, and never responded. Not because I was holding a grudge, because I genuinely didn't know what to say to that, and I had learned, finally, that silence was not the same thing as weakness. My brother-in-law still makes jokes at family gatherings. Fewer of them are directed at me now. I don't know if that's because of what happened or because he simply moved on to easier targets. It doesn't matter. I stopped waiting for the room to defend me a long time ago. What I know now is this. I spent years making myself smaller so that my presence wouldn't feel like a burden. I drove 3 hours on a Tuesday to show up to a party where I wasn't expected to matter. I painted a kitchen and fixed a fence and sat in hospital waiting rooms and never once asked for recognition because I thought love was supposed to work that way quietly, without a ledger, but they were keeping a ledger the whole time. They just assumed mine was empty. It wasn't. The fund is still there. I moved it into a more conservative account after everything settled. Something my financial advisor had been recommending anyway. I'm not rich. I'm not someone who can withdraw $1 billion and watch a room go silent. I'm someone who drove a sensible used car to a party and stood by a potted plant and chose not to make a scene. But I'm also someone who spent 4 months in a legal process that most people would have walked away from, who kept every receipt, who showed up every Sunday to weed a garden with her mother, while simultaneously dismantling the architecture of a lie built to keep her out. They called me a charity case. They filed documents designed to make me disappear. I just kept showing up. There's a version of this story that ends with a dramatic confrontation, something cinematic, something satisfying in the way movies are satisfying. I used to want that version. I used to think the only way to be taken seriously was to do something impossible to ignore. What I found instead is that the most permanent thing I did was the quietest. I put my name where it belonged and I didn't remove it. If you've ever been the one who drives 3 hours and stands by the plant and smiles when they say something that cost you, I want you to know you are allowed to stop asking for a seat. You are allowed to have already built something they didn't know about, and you are absolutely allowed to protect it. You don't have to burn anything down. You just have to stop letting them redecorate around you like you're not there.